Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the show with school measures to keep schools safe as the government described it being announced yesterday here in Ontario, as well as measures as what's being called the unvaxxed tax in the province of Quebec. Joining me now to discuss why these governments have made these various decisions, as well as the potential political impacts of doing so, is Jenni Byrne, Scott Reid, and Robert Benzie. So let's start out, Rob. I guess I'll start out with you. First of all, I'll start out with the unvaxxed tax that was announced in Quebec earlier this week. Premier Francois Legault gave a press conference today as well, where he didn't provide too many more details. I think a lot of the details of this still remain unknown. But what do you think? Do you think a lot of provinces have already made commitments that they're not going to do this? What do you think, though, in terms of the political impacts of doing this, and also the public opinion on doing it? Do you think measures like this are generally supported by the public?
Well, I mean, Wyatt, thanks for having us on. We have seen there was one Maru Blue poll that showed that this is a popular measure, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And we know that here in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford yesterday rejected any following up on Francois Legault's pretty half-baked scheme. I mean, Jenni and Scott know much more about how government works, the internal way of government, than I do. But I think that the way that this rolled out, it looked to me like a Hail Mary kind of pass that you do when you want to change the channel. Quebec has been the pandemic epicenter of Canada. 1,500 more deaths in that province than in Ontario, even though they only have 57% of the population. So they have some huge challenges there. And I think it's starting to catch up with Francois Legault, even though polling still suggests he's popular. I think that's starting to shift a little bit. They don't have a very good back to school plan. You doctors there are writing letters, public letters, saying that it's not safe the way that they're going back to school there as they go back on Monday. Whereas here in Ontario, they're spending a lot of money on N95 masks and masks for teachers and masks for kids, 3-ply masks for kids, and filters, things like that in classrooms that are just not in place in Quebec. So I think that what Premier Legault is doing is trying to deflect attention. And this is a really good grabby issue, and it's sticky, and people will talk about it, and it's probably popular. But that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, and it doesn't mean that they'll actually go ahead and do it. Because it opens a can of worms. I mean, if you want to violate the Canada Health Act, which guarantees equal healthcare to all Canadians, go about it by targeting people who aren't vaccinated. I mean, what's next? Am I going to target the people who are smokers? I'm going to target fat people. I'm going to target people who drink alcohol. That's gonna all of us are gonna be like, I mean, I don't want them to go that route.
Got the money.
Show them the money. But I think it's a slippery slope, and that's why the Canadian Civil Liberties Association came out against Legault's proposal. And it's not even at Queen's Park, the government that I cover, Andrea Horwath, the leader of the opposition, denounced it even before Doug Ford did. So that tells you that it's not a partisan wedge issue in Ontario, at least as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I'll also point out too, it was a bit after Andrea Horwath did, but Stephen Del Duca also denounced it at his press conference on that day as well. Jenni, so as Rob mentioned, Quebec's has implemented some of the strictest restrictions in pretty much all of Canada. They have a curfew in place right now that is going to end on Monday, though, as well as with this new tax that everyone's talking about. What's going to be the political implications, though, in terms of, Rob mentioned Premier Francois Legault is still popular, but does that popular kind of trend line eventually start to go down if, he keeps on implementing these more measures?
Yeah, no, listen, I agree with Rob in terms of, he said that in terms of like kind of a Hail Mary pass that this government is doing in terms of COVID policies, and it's in October that this government goes into re-election. And the one thing about Quebec politics, more so than anywhere else in the country, that you can say this, is it turns on a dime. And so I think that, like, if I was Francois Legault, I'd be very worried that all of a sudden these policies turn sometime in the next, his election is 10 months away. So that's almost a lifetime in Quebec politics. And so I would be very, very worried if I was him in terms of these policies, in terms of school reopenings, in terms of I agree with Rob in terms of what he said in terms of the health tax. I think that it's nothing like the sin tax that people are talking about that are on alcohol and tobacco. This would be akin to basically saying if someone, a drug addict, ended up in the emergency room, that you would charge them if they were overdosing. That's not what the universal healthcare system in Canada is. It's whether we support universal healthcare or not, and I think all of us on the pod do. But that's irregardless to the debate that we're having in terms of Quebec. So, Wyatt, if I was Francois Legault, I would be very worried as to how this debate could turn on me in the next few months.
And Scott, I'll give the same question to you as I gave to Jenni. Rob mentioned, obviously, kind of the internal part of government quite well. Do you think people in the Quebec government are concerned right now about, the potential political implications of this? Or do you think they do genuinely think that the majority of people in the Quebec population support these measures that are being implemented?
Well, So first of all, thanks for having me on, Wyatt. This is my first time on. It's awesome. And I know everybody comes on here and says, you're doing a great job. You're doing a great job. Leave some room for us, old middle-aged podcasters. Okay. Don't eat up all the space, buddy, but I'm excited for you. I have a slightly different political take. Both Jenni and Rob are saying that he's coming at it from a place of potential weakness, that he's anxious about whether or not he's vulnerable politically. I think it's the kind of thing that people do when they are flush and full with hubris and saying, I am strong and I have the majority and I can do things that other governments can't. And so I think, probably there's lots of misgivings. I think if you get into the senior bureaucracy of the government, they're going, this is not something. I'm sure that they got recommendations to not proceed this way. I'm sure there were legal briefs that said, you're dangling on the line here. What I dislike about it, and I dislike it intensely, what I really dislike about it is that it isn't just a sin tax where you say, oh, well, if you're going to choose to smoke, then we're going to make it a little more expensive for you. It really starts to create a barrier to a basic fundamental service, which is healthcare. And it says, I'm going to actually, if you're not vaccinated, I'm creating a disincentive for you to present yourself to a doctor, for you to present yourself to a hospital. If you're not feeling well, you're like, oh man, I don't want to let people know because then I'm going to get taxed and I'm going to be marked. And so to me, it starts to create a situation where the logic that people will embrace is, I better keep myself out of the healthcare system. And I think that's a dangerous place to go, particularly for people who are vaccinated, who, frankly, even though I disagree with their decision very much, they may well need the health care system more than anyone else. So I dislike this intensely. But I think it's the kind of thing that Legault is doing because he's not listening to anybody else. And he says, you know what, it's a 65-35, it's a 70-30 proposition. I'm kissing both my biceps. I'm flexing my muscles. I'm so popular I can get away with this. And I'm gonna bully the minority into the corner. And I think it's indicative of an increasingly authoritarian streak from the guy that I think, I'm a little anxious about what's going on with Francis Legault. He's getting a little too big for his britches.
Rob, in terms of the, actual universal healthcare system, there's been lots of talk about, I saw someone mentioned it just yesterday, that they're worried that this could, make the universal healthcare system, more fragile and give it more, exceptions and there be more exceptions for, having to pay for a certain type of healthcare. Do you think that is a valid concern?
Yeah, I mean, you open a Pandora's box, Wyatt, and this is the thing that worries me. I mean, I believe in vaccination. It is the only way out of the pandemic, and I'm glad that in Canada, 80-90% of people who are eligible are vaccinated, and Quebec has good vaccination rates. Ontario has good vaccination rates, and I'm encouraged by that. I feel very uncomfortable when governments target a very small minority, and Quebec has a record of this. Bill 21 is in a similar vein of where you're targeting people for the religious symbols that they wear. So if you wear a hijab or a kippah or a turban, you're not able to work in the public service in Quebec or be promoted if you already are there. And it's in that similar vein of targeting a minority. And I don't like it. It's not Canadian. It's not fair. And look, I think people who aren't vaccinated aren't using their heads. I think that they unless you have an allergy or something, I don't see why you wouldn't, because the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of getting your shots, and that we know that in Canada, we know that in every country in the world. And but I do think there is an element of targeting a very small minority, 10%, let's say it's 10% of people in Quebec aren't vaccinated. If you can get everyone whipped up and mad at those people, they're going to forgive you a lot of your sins. Curfews. I mean, if we had curfews, Jenni can attest to this. If we had curfews in Ontario, Doug Ford would have been run out of office already. I just cannot see how people in this province would have accepted curfews, and Quebec has had 2 waves of them.
I agree, Robin, and Wyatt. I just want to carry on what Rob was saying is that I think there's a lot of people that think that the average quote anti-vaxxer are like the people that we see on TV in terms of protesting. And Scott and I talk about this on another podcast that we're part of that I won't promote, although Air Quotes Media will be very upset if I don't say Curse of Politics, put on by the Hurly Burly and Air Quotes Media. But the fact of the matter is I think that's a very small percentage. I think we all know people that aren't vaccinated that have decided for one reason or another, and they don't fall into the category that they're going out and throwing rocks at politicians or what have you. They've just chosen, and we all know and love them. And so there is also part of a compassion in terms of what people are going through. We actually don't want to see people that get sick for whether it's pandemic, whether it's COVID, or whether it's something else. We don't want to see people that we love and care about have to go through this. And so I think it's more, we've seen the vaccination rates go up. I think as we've seen more and more people, when more of the science and the comfortableness that people have with vaccinations, and I think that is going to continue to go. But I think that the tact of more of a bullying nature, or basically saying, you can't participate in society, I don't think that's going to get the result that governments are looking for in terms of that.
And Scott, I'm gonna, when we look at, I'll give, vaccine, I've saw a couple of people use this as an example. Vaccine certificates, for example, when you looked at, for example, here in Ontario, Premier Ford was against them at the beginning, and then obviously now we have, a vaccine certificate program in the majority of spaces. So do you think that there's a possibility of something similar happening with this unvaxxed tax, where, as of right now, a large portion of the premiers, and as a matter of fact, all the premiers aside from Francois Legault, are against? Do you think any other premiers might eventually, kind of change their mind on this and support it?
I don't think so. Not unless you ended up in a situation where literally a healthcare system collapsed and people were looking to blame and to stigmatize people, and politicians said, I better get in front of the crowd with torches and pitchforks or they'll come for me. And so hopefully that won't happen. And I think it would also be troubling if that happened. I'm all for carrot and stick. I'm all for incentives to get people to take vaccines. I'm all for certain degrees of coercion to say, you ought to do this. And if you don't, you're going to find that your life is more and more limited. I think that that's all fair ball, but it's a question of what degree. It's a question of gradient. And where I really draw the line is when you say, well, I'm going to tax you and I'm going to single you out in that way. I go back to my other argument. I'm really anxious that the effect that it has is it says, well, I'm not going to engage with a healthcare system. And I think that it's a question to agree. And I think that a reasonable court would conclude, well, you're actually not just in creating an incentive for people to get vaccinated. You're actually creating a disincentive for people to reveal their status. And that's actually going to drive people underground in a real serious, ugly way, and deny people access to healthcare.
And I'll do one final round on school closures, because obviously that's, a pressing issue for a lot of people right now. We saw Minister Lecce gave his first public appearance for quite a while yesterday here in Ontario. Rob, what do you think in terms of, the government here in Ontario implemented, obviously they're giving N95 masks now to teachers and to educators. They're providing additional rapid tests. How much credit should be given to the government for taking measures that, some of their opposition critics have been calling for, and furthermore, public health experts have been calling for?
I mean, I don't know in terms of credit and blame, Wyatt. I do know that and Premier Ford acknowledged this last week. There's a lot of confusion. That was his word, a lot of anger and a lot of frustration among Ontarians. And I think it's because of the mixed messages on just before New Year's. The Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Kieran Moe, said schools would reopen on January 5th instead of January 3rd when they were supposed to reopen. And then on January 3rd, the Premier came out and said, no, schools are not going to open on January 5th because Omicron is swamping our healthcare system, and we are now going to reopen schools on January 17th, or they're going to stay closed till at least January 17th, he said, and then kids will learn online, as you've been doing and as my kids are doing. And Scott's kids, and it's not fun for kids. It's not good for their mental health, and I think it's not good for their parents' mental health either. And I think a lot of us were looking at this and saying, why these confusing messages, this zigzagging? Now, I was kind of relieved on a personal level when the news broke the other night that schools will in fact reopen on January 17th, and then you have the Minister of Education coming out and talking about all the different measures that they're putting in, and hopefully those will keep schools open. But it's still going to be a bit of a crapshoot, and that's because kids younger than you, Wyatt, are the 5 to 11 cohort. They're not getting as vaccinated as quickly as they should, even though Canada and Ontario in particular is leading the world in or among the world leaders in that cohort 5 to 11. Parents are still not getting their kids their shots. Fewer than 50% of kids have had their first shot, and they've only been eligible since November 23rd, but still you've only got about 3 or 4% that are fully vaccinated. So that tells you that there's some kind of reticence. I don't know why it is, or parents thinking the pandemic is over, there's no point. It's worrying. And if I was in government, I would be concerned about that.
But Rob, I think the reason they're reticent is that you even have Dr. Moore come out this week and say that the reason that they won't mandate vaccinations for kids 5 to 11 to go to school is the fact that this vaccine is too new to know and hasn't. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. So if you have a 5 to 11-year-old and you guys are parents, I don't have children. I have lots of niece and nephews and what have you. But if, you're now seeing that Ontario's doctor is saying that, and you're also seeing that it is a vaccine that has been for kids less than a year in terms of any studies, and that COVID hasn't hit that cohort the same way that it has hit people even our age and obviously older, that you make the decision if you have kids as to are you going to do it? And so I think that it's kind of it's become more and more understandable, I think, as to why parents might be wanting to do the wait and see to whether their kids are going to get shot or not.
And
and although Moore did clarify later on that he I think he was speaking what he was speaking. What he was saying was, yes, it's not going to be part of the compulsory, mumps, measles, rubella just yet, and it's not compulsory in any jurisdiction in North America that I know of. Certainly not in Canada. But I think he realized that what he said could be interpreted as being it's too experimental. We're not going to. I don't blame you for not doing it. So he walked that back about an hour or two later yesterday. But yeah, Jenny, to your point, there is reticence out there. Otherwise, it wouldn't be just in Ontario that it would be higher. It would be higher everywhere. And we're not seeing that in the United Kingdom. We're not seeing that in France or the US. So.
And so, Scott, I'll go to you last. When like obviously Jenny and Rob just touched on it. When we look at, the vaccination rates for the 5 to 11 age demographic, one of the things the Ford government announced yesterday was vaccine clinics in schools to prioritize that age demographic. So do you think that by doing that, obviously it'll increase the number of kids who are vaccinated? Do you think, though, it'll increase it by, the number that, people want to see? And furthermore, do you think that if it doesn't, if vaccine clinics don't increase vaccines by, the number that some people want to see, do you think there's other ways that it can be done? Or do you think then you just have to kind of accept it?
Well, I think it will happen. I think it's just a question of time. And I think one of the best reasons you can send your kids to school is to find out that they can access vaccines. I mean, if that's how it happens, then that's a wonderful thing, in the same way that some families just by dint of need, send their kids to school because that's the best place that they can get a meal. So I think that would be a grand public service. I'm underlying this entire policy is a giant question mark. And I'm relieved as a parent that the kids are going back to school, but I can't help but conclude through the fog of contradictions that have been thrown at us in the past 3 weeks that the real reason kids are going back to school is because keeping them out of school doesn't appear to be helping, but it does appear to be hurting. But that doesn't mean that it's going to make it better. And we just don't know we don't know where we'll be 2 weeks from now.
All right. Well, Robert, Benzie, Jenni Byrne, and Scott Reid, thanks so much for joining me. And it's been great chatting with you all.
Thanks
for having us, Wyatt.
Thanks, Wyatt. Have a good night.